Karine Jean-Pierre sat in her small apartment, nervously tapping her fingers on the table. In front of her were the notes from the last court session. Her face, usually calm and composed, was now tense. She was going over every detail of the case in which Judge Walters had delivered a verdict that sparked public outrage. The verdict was so unjust that it seemed like a farce. The suspect in a massive financial fraud case, a businessman with political ties, received only a suspended sentence, despite evidence that should have sent him to prison for years. Karine was certain that corruption was at play here, but she couldn't do anything about it, at least not officially. Her gaze stopped on a sheet with the judge's name, John Walters. The name stirred a bitter irritation within her. Walters had long been known as someone who played by his own rules, often dodging responsibility. The next day, Karine appeared in court as a mere observer. She caught the eye of Walters himself, and when the session ended, he approached her in the corridor. "What are you doing here?" the judge muttered, his gaze cold and contemptuous. "I'm just doing my job," Karine replied calmly. "Your job?" Walters sneered. "Your job is to sit quietly in the White House and not stick your nose into matters beyond your capabilities." Karine tried not to react, but his words struck deep. "If you're afraid of justice, I understand your fear," she answered quietly. Walters stepped closer. His voice dropped low, but every word oozed with venom. "Listen here, little local celebrity. If you ever speak up about me or my decisions again, I'll make sure you never have work or peace again." Karine took a deep breath, trying to hide the trembling in her hands. "You can try," she replied, not breaking eye contact. Walters laughed, but there was nothing joyful in his laugh. "We'll see who comes out on top," he muttered, then turned and headed for the exit. That was only the beginning. A few days later, Karine found her name appearing in scandalous articles with false accusations. It seemed Walters had decided to act quickly. But Karine wasn't about to give up. The next time she met Walters, she knew she had to do things differently. Karine waited for him in the courthouse corridor. The narrow marble walls amplified the sound of her footsteps, echoing in the cold space. She stood tall, arms crossed over her chest, when the heavy oak doors of the courtroom slowly creaked open. Judge Walters stepped out, straightening his black robe, his face giving away no emotion, only icy calm. "Oh, it's you again," he sneered, spotting Karine. "We need to talk," she replied evenly. Walters didn't stop and walked down the corridor past her. Karine took a step forward and blocked his way. "You won't be able to hide behind your position," she said firmly. "I know you took a bribe." Walters stopped and turned toward her, his gaze flashing with a dangerous glint. "Got any proof?" He raised an eyebrow mockingly. "If not, you'd better keep quiet before you lose everything." "The proof will come," Karine replied, stepping closer to him. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with anger. Walters smirked. "Interesting. So what are you planning to do? Go to the prosecutor's office? Maybe take it to the press?" His voice was low and cold. "I've been in this system for 25 years. You think I don't know how to shut people like you up?" Karine didn't look away. "Maybe you know how to silence others, but not me." Walters slowly tilted his head, appraising her. "You think you're special? That your position in the White House makes you untouchable? Believe me, I know people who can make your life miserable. Real miserable." Karine took a step closer, reducing the distance between them to just a few centimeters. "Try," she whispered. Walters sighed and smiled derisively. "Be careful, Karine. The higher you fly, the harder you'll fall." He walked on down the corridor, leaving her standing still, her heart racing. Karine knew he wasn't joking. That was a direct threat, not just to her career. But she wasn't about to back down. The next morning, Karine received an unsigned letter. On her office desk was a pristine white envelope with a printed message. "You don't know who you're playing with. Back off while it's still early." Karine clenched the letter in her hands. feeling cold fury building in her chest. She already knew Walters had pulled strings, but that could only mean one thing. She had hit the very heart of the corrupt system. "Want to play with me?" she whispered, staring at the paper. "All right, let's play." Karine started to act. The first step was careful surveillance of Walters. She collected all his financial reports, both official and unofficial. A friend of hers at the Ministry of Finance helped her check his accounts, but everything looked too clean. Too clean. "He's hiding it through offshore accounts," her friend said on the phone. "I'll raise some contacts, but it'll take time." "We don't have time," Karine replied. "Walters already knows I'm looking for something." The next day, Karine received another warning. Her car, parked outside her building, had its tire slashed. On the windshield, written in red marker, was the message, "Stop." Karine felt a chill run down her spine. She took a photo and sent it to the director of the Secret Service. An hour later, her phone rang. "We'll increase your security," a voice said from the other end. But that didn't stop her. Karine knew Walters felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. She had to keep going. That same day, she went to a private club in the city center, a frequent haunt of politicians and judges. Walters was sitting in the corner of a lavish room, surrounded by 3 men in expensive suits. He noticed Karine, and his expression darkened. She walked straight to his table and sat across from him. "What do you want?" Walters snapped coldly. "A confession," Karine replied. "Or I'll make sure your name becomes a headline in every media outlet in the country." Walters laughed. "You think anyone will believe that? You have no idea who my friends are." Karine leaned in closer. "Do you have any idea who my friends are?" Walters clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure. "I'll destroy you," he hissed. "Try," Karine smiled. She stood up and walked away, feeling the cold adrenaline rise inside her. She knew she was risking everything. But Walters was losing control, and that meant she was close to winning. That night, Karine received a message from her contact at the Ministry of Finance. "I found it. We'll meet tomorrow. This is what you need." Karine placed her phone on the nightstand. She knew tomorrow everything would change. Either she would destroy Walters, or he would destroy her. Her heart raced. She lay down in bed, staring into the darkness. This game has only just begun. Karine Jean-Pierre sat in her office at the White House, her gaze determined, yet her heart was beating faster than usual. She had been working as a secretary for so many years, seen and heard everything. But this time it was different. The injustice of Judge Walters was eating her up inside, and she knew. This wasn't just a case, it was a battle for her future. He had never considered her his equal. Over the years of working together, Karine had long understood that he lived by his own rules. But this incident with her father was one step too far. His insulting behavior toward her after the trial, the way he didn't even try to hide his contempt, could not be left unaddressed. She forced herself to pick up the phone and dial the number. "Hello, Denny, it's Karine." Her voice was calm, but each word felt heavy as stone. "We need to meet. It's urgent." The next day, Karine was in another city, meeting her old friend, Dennis, a private detective who had once helped her gather information on politicians with shady connections. She sat at a table in a small cafe, a quiet spot where even the usually noisy New York seemed peaceful. Dennis was dressed in a simple black jacket and dark sunglasses, even inside. His gaze was cold and attentive. When he saw Karine, there was no smile, no greeting. It meant that he, too, understood the seriousness of the situation. "What happened?" His voice was low and muffled, but it was immediately clear he was ready for any news. "Walters. He went as far as humiliating me after that trial. And not just me. This is part of a bigger game. He's using his position to clear out anyone who could threaten him. My father." "He used the same methods," Karine replied, her lips tightening. Dennis frowned. "I don't like this. He's too influential. If you've decided to go against him, You need to be ready for things to get worse. Karine took some documents from her bag and placed them in front of him. She raised her gaze. "I have one more question," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. "How do you feel about launching an investigation into his connections with other judges and prosecutors? I want to prove that this is not just one man's case, but a system he controls." Dennis leaned back in his chair and remained silent for a few minutes. His gaze was sharp as he considered every word. Then he nodded. "I'll find what you need, but you have to be ready that this story could tear you apart. You'll be in the spotlight, and every move you make will be under scrutiny. Are you ready for that?" Karine looked at him and gathered all her resolve. She felt how important this was, how it could change her life, but also the lives of many others. "I'm ready. This isn't just about me. It's about how the system undermines people's trust in justice. And I won't back down, even if I have to fight everyone he's bribed, even those who stand by his side." Weeks passed. Karine didn't stop fighting, but her life turned into an endless battle with fear. Walters began actively retaliating for her actions. She received anonymous threats, her personal information appeared in public sources, and recently, one of her close acquaintances was involved in a car accident. Still, she didn't retreat. Dennis worked tirelessly, uncovering more evidence of corruption that linked Walters to other high-ranking officials and businessmen. Meanwhile, Karine felt her strength fading. The fight against corruption turned out not just to be against one man, but a whole system that was willing to destroy her to protect its dark dealings. One morning, when she was nearly ready to give up, a new folder appeared on her desk. It was the same piece of evidence that could turn everything around. She gathered herself and planned a meeting with Dennis. And here it was, the moment. She made her move in the fight for the truth. Now, she just needed to decide how to proceed. But the radical step in her life, the decision she would have to make that night, could change everything. Karen stood in the dark corridor of the White House, feeling the cold air seep under her coat. With each step toward the office, she became more uncertain about her decision. She usually wasn't afraid, but this time everything felt different. The risk was so high that every move could be her last. She opened the door. Dennis was sitting at the desk, flipping through documents when she entered. His expression was serious, but not as calm as usual. On the desk lay new papers indicating that the situation was escalating. Walters had started to take action, and his network was likely much deeper than Karen had imagined. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Dennis asked, lifting his gaze. "There's no turning back now," she replied. "If we don't act now, I don't know when the next chance will come." Dennis slowly nodded, but concern appeared in his eyes. They had everything they needed to expose Walters, but he wasn't just a politician. He was part of a vast network. And more importantly, this network had influence over the very foundations of the government system. Karen sat down in a chair and pulled another folder from her bag. These were the latest details from Dennis. Information regarding Walters' business dealings and his connections with key judges and prosecutors. Their names were on the list, along with account numbers in several offshore companies. "This is what we need," Karen said, snapping her fingers on the folder. "Now we need to act quickly before he starts covering his tracks." Dennis glanced at his watch. "There's one catch. He's not going to leave this unanswered. I found out that he's ordered serious security for himself and his closest people. This isn't just a power struggle anymore. It's a war." "It won't stop me," Karen said firmly, though inside she could feel the fear breaking through her defenses. They had to make a choice, either act now or leave everything as it was. Karen knew she had a chance, but it required everything from her. The next day, Karen headed to the same courthouse where her father's case had recently been decided. She sat in the car, staring at the enormous building that seemed impenetrable. Everything inside her was going according to plan until she saw a familiar face. Judge Walters was standing by the entrance, holding a phone. He looked toward her car, and then his gaze met hers. Karine felt her heart tighten. This wasn't a coincidence. He knew she was getting closer to the truth. She tried to act like it didn't matter, but his look was so oppressive that it couldn't leave her indifferent. As soon as she got out of the car, Walters approached her. "Karine," he said coldly, "I thought you understood who you're dealing with. Do you want to keep going? Are you ready to risk everyone around you?" Her blood boiled. She couldn't let him win. "I'm ready to go all the way, Walters. And you know it." He smiled, but there was no joy or weakness in that smile. "You don't know who you're up against. Stay where you are while you still can. You won't survive this." She didn't respond, just turned and walked inside. Walters remained standing, still smiling. Inside the courthouse, Karine took the final step. She handed the documents to journalists who were already ready to begin the investigation. It was risky, but there was no other way. If she didn't act, she would disappear along with any chance of changing this system. By then, Dennis had already been working on the story, and Karine knew that soon Walters wouldn't be able to control the situation. But her plan had one big danger. Walters wasn't who he seemed. From now on, every step she took would be noticed, and even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Karine took another deep breath and watched as all her actions led up to the moment when this conflict would become irreversible. Karine couldn't turn back. She knew she had gone too far to stop now, and everything depended on how much pressure she could withstand. Walters was ready to act ruthlessly, but she was also ready for the fight, even if it meant losing everything she had. A few days after handing over the documents to the journalists, things began to gain momentum. At first, it was minor reports, but within hours, there were enough to catch the attention of federal agents. Karine watched the news on the television in her office as reports of corruption at the highest levels of government and suspicions surrounding Walters finally reached the public eye. Walters couldn't leave this unanswered. That night, when it seemed he had no strength left to fight, he went to meet Karine. It was his last attempt to convince her to back down. The meeting took place in one of the abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of the city, a place where there were no witnesses left. Walters was calm, but the fury burning in his eyes was undeniable. "Did you think this was it?" His voice sounded ominous. "You don't know who you're playing with." Karine, although she knew this could be her final moment, looked him in the eyes without fear. She held in her hands yet another stack of documents, the information she had gathered when almost everyone thought she had lost. This was her final trump card. "I'm not playing. And this time you've lost, Walters," she said firmly. Before her stood only one option: expose the truth or be consumed by the ruthless machine that had long since taken over the country. And she was ready to do whatever it took. Meanwhile, new facts were emerging that brought Walters down to a lower level. The press, which had once been afraid to intervene, could no longer ignore it. And while Walters still had some connections, the truth prevailed. Weeks later, the judicial authorities began to seriously consider the charges against him. Everything Karine had done became part of the larger struggle for justice, even if she no longer had the chance to be involved in the next steps. Walters was arrested, but that was just the beginning for the people behind him. Karine didn't leave the city. She knew this path wasn't over yet, but she felt her long struggle had brought justice. Now, when it was all over, she could finally say that risking everything to change the world hadn't been in vain. Only one question remained: what awaited her next, when the system shifted to a new stage of the fight? But this time, she was already ready. Karine stood on the balcony of her apartment in the city center, gazing at the streetlights flickering in the distance. It was a moment of silence after the storm, and she could feel her body finally relaxing after months of tension and struggle. Everything was changing. She could hardly believe that it had all happened. Despite the victory, Karine didn't feel joy. She felt a heavy exhaustion. She had found herself in the midst of a storm where there were no right decisions, where any step could lead to disaster. But now, as she looked at the city that never slept, she knew she had made the right choice. She had given the people a chance for change, a chance for a better future. Her phone in her pocket rang. She looked at the screen and saw it was her colleague from the security service. She knew the call could be important, but instead of answering right away, she decided to take a pause. A moment alone with herself was rare, and she didn't want to rush. She picked up the phone, and her colleague's voice came through the receiver. "Karen, we got the report. Another figure we hadn't noticed before was involved in all this. He's trying to flee." Her heart skipped a few beats. All her hopes that the victory was final could turn out to be premature. She couldn't just back down, not even now. "We can't let him escape," she said with a firmness that had developed in her voice over the past few weeks. She understood the war wasn't over, and perhaps she would have to return to what had already been. But now, unlike in the early days of this fight, she didn't feel fear. She was ready for the next step. A few hours later, Karen was in the same warehouse where she had met Walters weeks ago. It didn't take her long to find this new player in the scheme. When she entered the room, she saw a man she would have never suspected. Her gaze was cold and unwavering. "Did you think I had forgotten everything?" she asked, not paying attention to his nervous reaction. The man tried to appear calm, but Karen saw his weakness. She had always been able to tell who was in front of her, the person who would go to the end, and the person who craved power at any cost. And this time, it was the man's last mistake. She gave him the information that made him confess. The air of truth was so oppressive that it made everyone feel it, even those trying to operate behind the scenes. And within a few hours, this man became part of a larger case once again. The next morning, new forces arrived in the city. They were ready to uncover the remaining conspirators before it was too late. Important moments always change the course of history, and although many didn't yet know that Karine Jean-Pierre was the one who changed everything, her steps had immense significance. She could have simply left it all behind, left the world as it was, and run away, but she chose the path to the truth, which ensured a new beginning. And though the answer wasn't final yet, Karen knew. This time, she had done everything to ensure justice prevailed. Karen stood on the balcony of her apartment in the heart of the city, looking out at the streetlights flickering in the distance. It was a moment of silence after the storm, and she could feel her body finally relax after months of tension and struggle. Everything was changing. She couldn't even believe how far it had come. Despite the victory, Karen didn't feel joy. She felt a heavy fatigue. She had found herself in the midst of a storm where there were no right answers, where every decision could lead to disaster. But now, as she looked out at the city that never slept, she knew she had made the right choice. She had given people a chance for change, a chance for a better future. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw it was a call from her colleague in security. She knew the call could be important, but instead of answering immediately, she decided to take a pause. A rare moment alone with herself. She wasn't going to rush it. She picked up the phone, and in the receiver, she heard her colleague's voice. "Karen, we've got the report. There's another figure we missed earlier, and they're trying to flee." Her heart skipped a beat. All her hopes that the victory was final might have been premature. She couldn't just step back now, not after everything. "We can't let him get away," she said with a firmness that had grown in her voice over the past few weeks. She understood now that the battle wasn't over, and perhaps she would have to return to what had already been done. But now, unlike in the early days of this fight, she didn't feel fear. She was ready for the next step. A few hours later, Karen found herself in the same office where she had confronted Walters just weeks before. It didn't take long for her to track down this new player in the game. When she entered the room, she saw a man she never would have suspected. Her gaze was cold and unwavering. "Did you think I forgot?" she asked, ignoring his nervous reaction. The man tried to stay calm, but Karen could see his weakness. She could always tell who was in front of her, the person who would go to the end, and the one who would do anything for power. And this time, it was the latter's final mistake. She provided him with evidence that forced him to confess. The air was thick with the weight of truth, and it made everyone feel it, even those who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Within hours, this man, too, became part of the larger plot. By the next morning, fresh forces arrived in the city. They were ready to uncover the rest of the conspirators before it was too late. Important moments always change the course of history, and although many still didn't know that Karine Jean-Pierre was the one who had changed everything, her actions had significant consequences. She could have left it all, left the world as it was, and walked away, but she chose the path of truth, one that secured a new beginning. And though the answer wasn't final yet, Karine knew this. This time, she had done everything to ensure that justice would prevail.